This morning, we're going to be looking at the fourth path of our journey by turning to the Gospel of Luke. And our primary question will be, how do we mature in service? On this path, we're going to learn better how to give and receive love, how to be a person of respect not only to others, but also to ourselves, how to build deep friendships, how to navigate ongoing challenges in the spiritual life with both strength and equanimity, and how to constantly abide in the presence of God's peace. This path helps us to remember that spiritual transformation is not a magic trick. Have you ever wanted this to be the case? If you have, raise your hand. Remember, you're in church, you can't lie. I think all of us have at one time or another wanted to say a magic prayer or just read just the right book or get the perfect insight in a counseling session, whatever the case might be, so that all of our problems just dissolve and we are the epitome of spiritual maturity. And so often we navigate big change, or we endure a season of suffering, or we experience some kind of powerful insight or revelation, and then we expect a major spiritual transformation to happen very quickly after those things happen. And sometimes, on the other side, we assume that our greatest trials and tribulations are over, and then everything is going to start flowing in a positive direction. And then Christianity will be lollipops and candy canes. We will have the fulfillment of our wildest dreams. But Luke reminds us that these are unrealistic expectations that can actually sabotage our spiritual journey when we are disappointed by real-life experiences. So if those are our expectations, and then we have experiences that show them not to be the case, then we might get discouraged and say, maybe this Christianity thing, maybe this idea of following Jesus is not all that it's cracked up to be. Maybe following Jesus doesn't lead to all of the promises that the preachers have been telling me about all of my life. Now, while we do receive striking insights, important revelations, and powerful experiences of God that change and move us forward along the disciples' path, Luke reminds us that spiritual maturity takes a long time. Indeed, if we read the Bible, it tells us that we are forever growing in the image of Christ. From the day that we're born until the day that we die, that journey is not complete. It's not like we get to a point in our faith and we say, oh yeah, now I have arrived. Now I'm spiritually awake. Now I'm perfected in love and compassion, right? No, this takes time for us to mature, and it takes a lifetime for us to fully grow into the image of Christ. So after we navigate change, endure seasons of suffering, and wake up to the presence of God, there's still more spiritual work to do. And we can't check out or rest on our laurels. There are still more wounds to be healed, more habits and compulsions to be broken. There are old patterns that need to be undone, and old feelings that need to be resolved. And we need to cultivate new ways of seeing, thinking, and acting. If you remember, we read it in the letters of Paul that God's not interested in simply you changing your mind about a few things. It's not just about coming to intellectually assent to the proposition that Jesus is God's Son, as if that were enough. That's only the beginning. What God wants is a complete transformation of your mind, a complete revolution of your mind, so that you see the world differently and you experience the world differently. And as a result, you act differently. And this is the ongoing work of the fourth path as disclosed in the Gospel of Luke. So as we mature in service, it's important to remember that we are going to continue to face more change later on down the road. We're going to experience more suffering, and we're going to gain more insight and receive more joy in the midst of all of these challenges and struggles as well. Why? Because these four paths work together to produce the fruit of the Spirit. You guys remember what the fruit of the Spirit are? Love. How many people would like more love in their life? Love and joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and what's the last one? It's the one I like the least. Self-control. So the more we continuously walk the four paths, the more we recognize and receive and integrate these gifts, and the more our presence in the world blesses other people and honors God, the more our life bears faithful testimony to the goodness of God without us even saying anything. But we don't get there without walking the path of humble service, without learning day in and day out how to practice the teachings of Jesus in the ordinary routines of our life in both big and small ways. And the danger on this path that's always lurking around the corner is the compulsion to get rid of anxiety. As we are faced with daily challenges and new problems, our ego tries to jump in and fix things by ridding us of our discomfort. So we get triggered and we feel anxiety or frustration or anger or something else that makes us uncomfortable, and our ego jumps in and says, I can get you out of that. Here's a glass of wine. Here's a joint. Here's someone that you can cling on to in a codependent relationship. Here's some money to go shopping. Here's some TV to distract you, right? The ego jumps in and says, I can get you out of this anxiety. But the only way that the ego knows how to do this is by returning to old, immature patterns. And these immature patterns, while they are legion, there are two that are constantly knocking on the door. One of them is the habit of blaming others. So we feel discomfort, and instead of trying to figure out where that's coming from within us, we point the finger at other people and we blame them for our discomfort, for our anxiety. Another is to internalize anger and to blame ourselves, a kind of self-recrimination that usually leads to depression. And both blame and self-recrimination and depression, these things keep us stuck. They prevent us from moving forward into spiritual maturity. And in fact, they cause us to regress. And so learning how to deal with challenge, frustration, anger, anxiety, all kinds of discomfort, without spiritually and emotionally regressing, without turning to blame or self-hatred, is one of the gifts that is offered in the fourth path of our journey. So as we stand in the courage of our journey, remaining steadfast in times of inner discomfort, praying and using Luke's gospel as a tool, we can be set free from old patterns and experience the freedom, peace, and joy of spiritual maturity. And in this way, we build a whole new life for ourselves. We discover how to recognize and employ our gifts to heal and deepen all of our relationships. We also come to see the ambiguity and complexity of life, abandoning overly simplistic black and white ways of seeing the world, which involve dividing people up into nice, neat categories and labeling them for the purposes of external control and internal security. Rather, we see the unity of all people, the unity of all things in the Spirit of God. And we are no longer duped by easy answers or cheap religiosity, but we are guided and shaped by genuine truth and wisdom. that comes from the very mouth of God. As we walk the fourth path and draw on the resources in Luke, we find our true self, and we learn to accept and embrace who we are at the level of soul, the deepest part of ourself. And this kind of self-acceptance then moves outward into the acceptance of other people, cultivating a love without insecurity, threat, or competition. We enjoy a peaceful, mutually enriching unity in diversity. And this is also where we most powerfully encounter the mystical body of Christ, which is the true church united in love and mission to the whole world. As we shall see, the most notable characteristic or quality that emerges on the fourth path is compassion. The word compassion literally means to suffer with. The prefix "com" means with, and the word passion means to suffer. To suffer with someone. And so one of the greatest gifts of this path, and this is something that I'm working on diligently in my own spiritual life, is this really, really important shift away from judgment to compassion. That's pretty hard, isn't it? When we look around and we experience people in all of their differences, and our tendency is to then draw a sharp contrast and to think that we're right or superior, and then to pass judgment on those people and then keep them at arm's length so that they don't frustrate or hurt us. And so judgmentalism is really a tool that helps us to defend ourselves against what we perceive to be a threat in their difference. But on this path, we learn how to face our fears, to do the right thing despite our fears, and then we see our fears gradually dissipate, sometimes quickly, sometimes slowly. But if we continue to stay close to Jesus, those fears will always dissipate. And as those fears are relieved in our hearts and minds, then we can resist the compulsion to judge someone and instead have compassion on them, to literally step into their suffering and walk beside them, being a part of their healing. And it's not only compassion for others that is a gift in the fourth path. Equally important, it is also to have compassion on ourselves. Because oftentimes, we are harder on ourselves than we are on other people. As someone wise once told me, you need to be more merciful with yourself as God is merciful toward you. And as we experience more self-acceptance, as we have more compassion on ourselves, and as that spills out in our relationship with other people, and we have more compassion for them, this manifests itself in all kinds of wonderful virtues like mutual respect, genuine love, kindness, mercy, and justice, which is just another way of talking about fairness. So as we travel together on the fourth path illuminated by the Gospel of Luke, we will get a profound revelation that will change us forever. And if you've had this aha moment, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's the insight that my life is not merely about me. Have you had that insight yet? When we're young and we're trying to build a container called ego to house our identity, we are inherently selfish. We have to focus on ourselves. But at some point, we have a strong enough ego to house our identity, and then once we build that container, we spend the second half of our life trying to deconstruct that container so that we can give that self away. And so we get the insight on the fourth path that it's not all about me. It's not that I'm not important. It's not that God doesn't have good things for me. But it's more than that. It's that other people are equally important, and that the gifts that God gives to me are intended to be shared with others. Here in the Gospel of Luke, we discover that the only life worth living is a life of loving service, a life in which we share ourselves and our gifts with others. But this is only possible as we embody the life of Christ, which is to say, as we practice, not just learn, but practice the teachings of Jesus in all of our relationships, day in and day out, in small things and in large things. And through a combination of inner exploration and outer practice, we mature in service, and this is how we actually cultivate new ways of seeing and feeling and thinking and acting. This is how we dispense with old self-destructive patterns that keep us stuck in pain and frustration, and how we cultivate new habits and patterns that lead to the flourishing of life. But as I've been saying repeatedly for the last 22 weeks, it's not a magic trick. You have to take responsibility for your own spiritual life and your own spiritual growth. You have to make a decision. I am going to be a follower of Jesus. An explicit, conscious, intentional decision. I want to follow. And then you have to be intentional about learning the different spiritual practices that you will need in order to be healed of your brokenness and empowered to be continually transformed into the image of Christ. And then you have to let the rubber hit the road by actually doing it. So, over the next 3 weeks, we will enter into a season of active waiting and focus on the Christmas story in the Gospel of Luke. And this morning, my challenge is very simple. I want you to set an intention for yourself. As we turn our focus to the sacrament of Holy Communion, I want to invite you to capture a vision of spiritual maturity that actually fits who you are in Jesus Christ, drawing on the promises of the fourth path that I've tried to preview in this message. I want you to try to get a picture in your mind's eye of the kind of transformation that you long to see in your life. Have you given this any thought? Right? I mean, there are two reasons for not doing this. The first, of course, is to say, I'm not capable of transformation. I'm so messed up. I'm so stuck in bad patterns that there's really not much hope that I'm going to be different 10 years from now, so why should I even try? And this is not only a problem for young people who are trying to figure out the things in life that short-circuit their spiritual growth. This is a huge temptation for our seniors who are retired. To think, well, I've already lived 70 or 80 years of life, and I'm pretty set in my ways, and there's not much hope of radical transformation for me. If you say that, you're calling Jesus a liar. Because Jesus wants you to continue to be transformed into His image until the day that you take your final breath. And guess what John Wesley, our founder, says? John Wesley says that even when we go to heaven, God is still the creator and we are still the created. And in that relationship, Wesley says, we will grow spiritually for eternity. We'll never stop growing. So if you're 80 years old and you think that you're done, you've just gotten a glimpse of the transformation that God is going to bring, not only throughout the rest of your natural earthly life, but even more transformation in the life to come. And so as we move through Advent, I don't want you to get discouraged and refuse to set an intention because you're down on yourself and you don't think you're capable of very much more change. The other pitfall is to think, well, I'm pretty good as I am, and so why would I need to change much anymore? That's pride. To assume that you have arrived at a point in your spiritual journey when you don't need God to continue to work transformation in your life. And I would pray that we would avoid both of these pitfalls and to be able to enter into the presence of God and humbly ask God to do for us what we cannot do for ourselves, which is to be healed of our hurts, to be set free of our compulsions, and to continue to grow in the freedom, love, peace, and joy of Jesus Christ. And as we move through this season of Advent, this morning, I want you to ponder what needs to change. And I want to invite you to gather your faith and gather your hope as we embark on the fourth leg of our journey. Believing that God can and will accomplish this work in your life if you will stay close to Him and give yourself away in loving service. I want you to see it, I want you to believe it, and I want you to set that intention this morning. And I want you to meditate on it throughout the week, so that when we return next Sunday and we begin to look at the stories of the birth of Christ in the Gospel of Luke, your heart will be open and ready to receive whatever it is that God has for you this Christmas season.